The great hall of the Silver Moon Pack was a cacophony of boasts and brittle laughter. Serafina felt each sound like a physical blow, shrinking further into the shadowed alcove she had claimed as her own. She was a ghost at this feast, a mandatory specter haunting the edges of the grand conclave. Her alpha, her cousin Marcus, had insisted she attend. "Every member of the pack will show their face," he had snarled, his words a thinly veiled threat, "even the broken ones." Broken. The word echoed in the hollow space where her wolf should have been. While others felt the proud, warm presence of their inner beast, Serafina felt only a profound silence. She was an omega, the lowest of the low, but even other omegas had wolves that whispered to them. Hers had been silent since her first shift, a failed, painful contortion of limbs that had produced nothing but shame. Her gaze drifted across the hall to her sister Clara. She was everything Serafina was not. Vibrant, strong, her wolf's presence a radiant aura that drew others to her like moths to a flame. She was currently laughing at something a handsome alpha from the Sunstone Pack had said, her head thrown back, her golden hair catching the light of the chandeliers. She had not looked Serafina's way once all evening. Association with the wolfless Omega was a stain no one wanted. A wave of bitter cold washed over Serafina, a familiar companion. It was the shame, so potent it felt like a physical chill. She clutched the thin fabric of her drab gray dress, a hand-me-down that hung loosely on her frame. She was 20 years old, and her life was already a foregone conclusion, a lifetime of servitude and scorn, a cautionary tale whispered to unruly pups. She focused on breathing, a small trick she had learned to keep the panic at bay. In, out. She tried to find a quiet center within herself, a tiny spark of warmth in the vast cold emptiness. It was a strange ability she possessed, one no one else seemed to value. Sometimes, when a pup was frightened or an elder was in pain, she could sit with them, and a measure of peace would settle over them. They never knew why. They would just sigh, their tense muscles relaxing, and thank her for her quiet company before forgetting her again. It was her only secret, this small, useless magic of calm. It did little to soothe her own roiling anxiety now. Marcus strode to the center of the hall, his chest puffed out. He was a brute of an alpha, ruling through fear and intimidation. "My friends! Alphas of the great packs!" he boomed, his voice dripping with false joviality. "Tonight, we celebrate our strength, our unity, and we await the arrival of our great leader, the Alpha King." A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of awe and terror. The Alpha King, a monarch of mythic proportions, a warrior who had clawed his way to the throne over the bodies of his rivals. He was said to be more beast than man, his cruelty legendary. No one had seen him in years. He ruled from his dark, isolated fortress in the northern mountains, his decrees delivered by grim-faced emissaries. His sudden decision to attend the conclave had sent shockwaves through the territories. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs. A king. Here. It was just another opportunity for her to be found wanting, to be seen as the flaw in an otherwise perfect pack. All she wanted was to disappear, to melt into the stone walls and be forgotten. But she knew, with a certainty that tasted like ash, that the night was far from over. Marcus had a particular look in his eye, a cruel, calculating glint that always meant her suffering was imminent. The great oak doors of the hall groaned open, a deep, resonant sound that silenced every conversation. 2 guards, clad in obsidian armor that seemed to drink the light, stepped inside. They moved with a predatory grace that made the pack alphas, powerful in their own right, look like clumsy pups. Between them stood a figure who commanded the very air in the room, drawing it into his lungs and leaving everyone else breathless. It was him, King Alistair. He was taller than any wolf shifter Seraphina had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his brutal reputation. His hair was as black as a starless night, and his eyes, as they swept the room, were the color of a winter storm. They held no warmth, no mercy, only a chilling, absolute authority. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, a stark white line against his tanned skin, a permanent reminder of a violence she could not begin to imagine. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. He was not just a king, he was a force of nature. Power radiated from him in palpable waves, a crushing pressure that demanded submission. Every alpha, including the arrogant Marcus, bowed their heads. Every wolf, strong and proud, lowered their gaze. It was an instinctual, primal response to a predator of unparalleled might. Seraphina, hidden in her alcove, felt the force of his presence like a physical impact. It wasn't just power she felt from him, but something else. Something fractured and raw beneath the iron control. It was a chaotic storm of agony, so immense and overwhelming that she instinctively flinched, her own fragile peace shattering at the mere proximity of his pain. She had never felt anything like it. It was a silent scream that no one else seemed to hear. His cold gaze continued its sweep, dismissing the powerful alphas as if they were nothing. He seemed to be searching for something, his expression a mask of grim impatience. His eyes passed over her alcove, and for a fractional second, they paused. Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. She was shrouded in shadow, insignificant, a mote of dust in a room of blazing fires. He couldn't have seen her. Yet, she felt the weight of that fleeting glance. It was as if he had looked past her drab exterior and seen the strange, silent flicker within her. The chaotic tempest inside him seemed to quiet for a barest instant, a moment of stillness in a hurricane. Then his gaze moved on, and the crushing pressure returned. He moved to the high table, his movements fluid and dangerous. He did not sit, but stood behind the ornate throne-like chair reserved for him, his presence dominating the entire hall. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with fear. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. They were all waiting for the Beast King to pass judgment, to find them wanting, to unleash the legendary wrath that had built his kingdom. Seraphina pressed herself harder against the cold stone, wishing she could phase through it. She had seen the look on Marcus's face when the king entered. It was a look of fawning ambition mixed with his usual cruelty. And she knew, with a sickening lurch in her stomach, that his gaze had flickered towards her. He was planning something. He was going to use her, his broken Omega, in some twisted play for power. Marcus finally broke the suffocating silence. He straightened up from his bow, a sycophantic smile plastered on his face. He stepped forward, his voice unctuously loud in the quiet hall. "Your Majesty, King Alistair, the Silver Moon Pack is deeply honored by your presence. We are but humble servants to your great throne." Alistair's stormy eyes settled on him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The king said nothing, his silence a more potent weapon than any threat. He simply waited, letting Marcus squirm under the weight of his unimpressed gaze. Sweat beaded on Marcus's brow, but he plowed on, driven by his desperate ambition. "As a token of our unwavering loyalty and profound respect, we wish to offer a tribute. A small, insignificant gift, to be sure, for one such as yourself. But it is given with the deepest humility." His eyes, gleaming with malice, found Seraphina in her alcove. He gestured towards her. "We offer this Omega for your retinue, to serve in any way you see fit." A wave of shocked, derisive murmurs swept through the crowd. Clara's face was a mask of horror and embarrassment. Offering a wolfless Omega as a tribute to the Alpha King was not a gift. It was an insult. It was a joke. Marcus was either insane or playing a game so cruel it defied understanding. He was presenting Seraphina's brokenness as the sum of his pack's worth, a public declaration of her utter worthlessness. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through Seraphina. He had dragged her here for this. To be publicly paraded as a piece of defective property, to be offered up and undoubtedly rejected, cementing her status as less than nothing. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She couldn't look up, couldn't meet the pitying and contemptuous stares she felt burning into her. She is quiet and requires little, Marcus added, twisting the knife. She will be no trouble. All eyes turned to the king. Everyone expected a thunderous rejection, perhaps even a violent punishment for such a blatant insult. The air crackled with anticipation. King Alistair's gaze moved from Marcus to where Seraphina stood frozen in her corner. This time, his eyes did not pass over her. They locked onto her, and the world seemed to fall away. The noise, the stares, the suffocating shame, it all faded into a dull hum. In his gaze, she saw not disgust or contempt, but a flicker of something she couldn't name. An unnerving stillness, a deep, piercing curiosity. The raging storm inside him, the one only she could feel, seemed to abate again, just for a moment, under his own focused attention on her. "I accept," he said. The two words fell into the stunned silence of the hall like stones into a still pond. Disbelief rippled through the crowd. Marcus himself looked momentarily shocked before his expression morphed into one of triumphant glee. He had succeeded in his humiliation of her, and somehow, inexplicably, had not been struck down for it. Seraphina's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. Accepted? The Beast King had accepted her? It was a nightmare. This wasn't a reprieve, it was a death sentence of a different kind. To be a servant to a man whose court was likely filled with killers and monsters, a man who radiated such profound pain and power. One of the king's obsidian-clad guards moved towards her. Her legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot by sheer terror. The guard took her arm in a firm but not unkind grip, gently pulling her from the shadows and into the unforgiving light of the hall. She stumbled forward, her gaze fixed on the imposing figure of the king. He had not taken his eyes off her. It felt as if he were looking straight into her soul, and for the first time in her life, she felt as if someone, something, was looking back. The walk to the king's private wing was a blur of opulent corridors and silent armored guards. Seraphina was numb, moving on legs that didn't feel like her own. The guard who had collected her, a grim-faced man whose name she later learned was Gideon, led her through a set of heavy carved doors and into an antechamber that was larger than her entire family's cottage. A fire roared in a massive stone hearth, but it did little to warm the chilling atmosphere of the place. "Wait here," Gideon instructed, his voice low and gravelly. He disappeared through another door, leaving her alone in the cavernous room. She stood stiffly in the center of the rug, too terrified to move, too overwhelmed to think. This was her new reality, a gilded cage, ruled by a monster. What did he want with her? Why had he accepted Marcus's insulting offer? Was this some elaborate, cruel game? Perhaps he meant to make an example of her, to show the alphas what happened when they offered him trash. The door opened again, and King Alistair entered. He had shed his formal tunic for a simple black shirt that did little to hide the powerful muscles of his chest and arms. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that made her heart leap into her throat. The storm of his inner turmoil was back, a low, thrumming hum of agony that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. He stopped several feet away from her, his stormy eyes raking over her form. She felt small and insignificant under his scrutiny, like a field mouse before a hawk. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to submit. You are the wolfless Omega, he stated. It was not a question. Yes, Your Majesty, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He prowled the room, his movements restless, caged. He didn't look at her again, but she felt his awareness of her in every fiber of her being. My beta, Gideon, will show you to your quarters. They are adjacent to mine. You will not leave this wing without my express permission. The finality in his tone was absolute. She was a prisoner. What? What are my duties, my lord? She managed to ask, her voice trembling. He finally stopped his pacing and turned to face her. A muscle worked in his jaw. Your duty is to remain silent and stay out of my sight. Do not speak to me unless spoken to. Do not touch anything. Do not get in my way. Is that understood? Yes, my lord. The words were a hollow echo of her fear. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That flicker of curiosity she had seen before was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask. The pain inside him seemed to spike, and he winced, a nearly imperceptible tightening around his eyes. He turned his back on her abruptly. Go, he commanded, his voice a low growl. Get out. Gideon reappeared as if summoned, his expression as stoic as ever. He nodded once to Seraphina and led her from the room. Her quarters were small but clean, with a narrow bed and a small window that looked out onto a stone courtyard. It was more a cell than a room. As the door clicked shut behind Gideon, Seraphina finally allowed herself to crumble. She sank onto the bed, wrapping her arms around herself as silent tears tracked down her face. She had been cast out by her pack, disowned by her family, and handed over to a terrifying king who radiated a pain so profound it made her soul ache. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Sleep offered no escape. Seraphina tossed and turned on the thin mattress, her mind replaying the horrors of the evening. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the king's stormy gaze, felt the crushing weight of his presence, and sensed the chaotic agony that churned beneath his cold exterior. It was a feeling that settled deep in her bones, an empathetic echo that left her feeling raw and exposed. It was well past midnight when a sound from the adjacent chamber jolted her into full awareness. It was a low growl, but not the sound of a wolf. This was deeper, harsher, laced with a suffering so profound it was inhuman. It was the sound of something breaking. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Fear urged her to stay put, to hide under the thin blanket and pretend she had heard nothing. But another instinct, the same one that drew her to soothe crying pups, pulled her from the bed. It was a foolish, dangerous impulse, but the sheer torment in that sound was something she couldn't ignore. Tiptoeing to the door that connected their rooms, a servant's passage, she assumed, she pressed her ear against the cold, heavy wood. The growling intensified, punctuated by a sharp, guttural cry of pain. It was the king. She could hear the heavy thud of a fist against a wall, followed by the splintering of wood. Driven by a desperate, inexplicable need to understand, she found a tiny crack in the doorframe, a sliver where the wood had warped. She peered through it, her breath held tight in her chest. The sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. King Alistair was on his knees in the center of his opulent chamber. His powerful body was rigid with strain, his back arched. But it was the energy swirling around him that terrified her. It was not a physical thing, but she could see it with a sense she didn't know she possessed. Wisps of black, shadowy energy coiled around his limbs like venomous snakes. They seemed to emanate from him, from the very core of his being, a manifestation of the inner torment she had sensed. He clutched his head, his knuckles white, his body racked with tremors. No, he gritted out through clenched teeth, not now. I will not. His voice was a raw rasp of agony and desperate willpower. He was fighting something something inside him that was trying to break free. This was his secret. This was the source of the storm. It wasn't just a temper or a cruel disposition. It was a curse. A living, breathing affliction that caused him unimaginable pain. The legendary cruelty, the iron control, the isolation. It was all a cage he had built around this monstrous thing inside him. As she watched, a wave of the shadowy energy pulsed outwards. The fine crystal goblet on a nearby table shattered without being touched. The flames in the hearth flared violently, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. His control was slipping. Serafina recoiled from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She finally understood. He hadn't accepted her as a servant. He had felt it too. That momentary stillness when his eyes had met hers. Her strange, useless ability to soothe, to bring calm. It had somehow, inexplicably, touched the raging hurricane inside the most powerful and dangerous man in the world. And now, she was trapped here. A tiny candle next to an impending explosion. Days bled into a terrifying, monotonous routine. Serafina existed in the silent spaces of the king's wing, a ghost in his gilded prison. She did as she was told. She stayed out of sight. She cleaned her small room, ate the simple meals left for her by silent servants, and spent hours staring out her window at the cold, gray stone of the courtyard. She never saw the king during the day. He was consumed by the duties of his kingdom, a relentless machine of governance and command. But she felt his presence. The entire wing thrummed with the low-grade energy of his constant struggle. It was a background radiation of pain that kept her perpetually on edge. At night, she would hear him. The muffled sounds of his battle against the curse would seep through the walls. A pained grunt, a shattered object, the low, desperate growl of a man holding a monster at bay. Each sound was a fresh spike of fear in her heart, but it was mingled with a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. She was terrified of him, but she couldn't help but feel for the man enduring such a private hell. She saw Gideon come and go, his face always a mask of grim concern. He often carried small, lead-lined boxes. Once, the lid was slightly ajar, and she caught a glimpse of what was inside. A vial containing a liquid that glowed with a faint, silvery light. Potions. They were trying to control the curse with alchemy, with magic. From the sounds she heard each night, it wasn't working very well. The loneliness was a heavy cloak. She missed the forests of her home, the scent of pine and damp earth. She even missed the familiar scorn of her pack. At least there, she had known her place. Here, she was an unknown quantity in a terrifying equation, her purpose a mystery that filled her with dread. What was he waiting for? When would he decide what to do with the strange Omega who seemed to have a phantom effect on his curse? She began to explore the small library attached to the king's study, a room she was technically forbidden from entering, but which was often left empty. The books were ancient, their leather covers cracked with age. Most were histories of war and lineage, but she found a small section on old magic and curses. She devoured the texts, searching for anything that might explain what she had seen. She read of shadow beasts and soul eaters, of bloodline curses passed from generation to generation. One passage spoke of a devouring wolf, a curse that twisted a shifter's inner animal into a creature of pure chaotic energy, one that fed on the host's pain and rage, growing stronger with every negative emotion until it consumed them entirely. The description sent a chill down her spine. It was too close, too accurate. Her understanding grew, and with it, her fear. The potions Gideon brought were likely suppressants, temporary measures to cage a beast that was growing stronger every day. King Alistair wasn't just a man with a curse, he was a walking, ticking bomb, and she was locked in the room with him. It happened on the 7th day. A wave of violent energy rolled through the king's wing, so potent it made Serafina drop the book she was reading. It was followed by a roar of pure, unadulterated agony that was more beast than man. It came from the king's study. Panic seized her. This was different. This was worse than the nightly struggles. This felt like a breaking point. She heard a heavy crash, the sound of Gideon crying out in alarm. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide in her room and lock the door. But her feet were already moving, carrying her towards the source of the sound. She pushed open the heavy study door to a scene of chaos. Gideon was slumped against the far wall, a trickle of blood at his temple, dazed. Bookshelves were overturned, their contents strewn across the floor. In the center of the room, King Alistair stood, his body rigid, his head thrown back. The shadowy tendrils of energy were thicker, blacker than she had ever seen them. They writhed around him, lashing out and carving gouges in the stone walls. His eyes were glowing with a malevolent crimson light. He was losing. "My lord!" "Fight it!" Gideon gasped, trying to push himself to his feet. The king didn't seem to hear him. A low snarl ripped from his throat as one of the shadow tendrils lashed towards his loyal beta. Without thinking, without any conscious decision, Serafina moved. She ran into the room, placing herself between the king and Gideon. "Stop!" The word was a breathless squeak, but it was enough. The moment she entered the maelstrom, something shifted. The chaotic, violent energy that filled the room seemed to hesitate. The lashing tendril of shadow vaporized into smoke just inches from her face. The crimson glow in Alistair's eyes flickered. He stared at her, his chest heaving. The storm of his curse, which had been a raging typhoon, suddenly met a strange, unmovable point of calm. It didn't disappear, but the winds lessened, the waves subsided. The writhing shadows around him receded, pulling back into his skin as if startled. He blinked, and the red light in his eyes faded, leaving them their normal stormy gray. He looked from her to Gideon, then back to her, confusion and shock warring on his face. The immense pressure in the room dissipated, leaving a ringing silence. "What?" he rasped, his voice raw. He took a staggering step back, clutching his head as if expecting the pain to return in full force. But it didn't. There was a reprieve. Gideon stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had just witnessed the impossible. Serafina stood frozen, her heart pounding like a drum. Her presence. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't her imagination. Her strange, quiet nature had a tangible effect on his curse. She was an anchor in his storm. Alistair's eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a wolfless omega, not as a political tribute, but as the source of this unbelievable, unprecedented moment of peace. The cold mask was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. "You," he breathed, the word full of disbelief and a dawning, terrifying hope. He took a step towards her. "Stay." It wasn't a command from a king to a servant. It was a plea from a drowning man to a lifeline. "Do not leave my side." Her life changed in that instant. She was no longer a ghost confined to the annex of his existence. She became a fixture at its very center. The king's command was absolute. "Do not leave my side." And so, she did not. It was a strange, silent companionship. She sat on a small, uncomfortable chair in the corner of his study while he worked. He would pore over maps, draft decrees, and meet with his grim-faced commanders, and she would simply be there, a quiet, calming presence in the room. The air, which had always crackled with his contained violence, grew still. The low hum of his pain lessened to a manageable thrum. They rarely spoke. In the beginning, she was too terrified, and he seemed to have no words for the strange symbiosis they had fallen into. But a new language formed between them. She learned to read the subtle tightening of his jaw that meant the curse was whispering at the edges of his control. She learned that the way he clenched his fist on the arm of his chair meant a memory of some past battle was haunting him. In turn, he seemed to learn her. He noticed when she was tired and would dismiss his counsel early with a curt wave. He had a tray of food brought for her when she forgot to eat, lost in one of the library's old books which she was now permitted to read. He never commented on it, but these small gestures were more shocking than any royal proclamation. One afternoon, while he was deep in concentration, a wave of pain washed over him so suddenly that he gasped, dropping his quill. His hand went to his temple, his knuckles white. Seraphina stood up without thinking, her heart aching at the sight of his struggle. "My lord?" she whispered. He didn't open his eyes. "It is an echo," he gritted out. "The curse remembers its power." She took a hesitant step closer, then another, until she was standing beside his chair. Every instinct told her to keep her distance, that he was dangerous. But the empathic pull was stronger. She slowly, tentatively, reached out her hand and placed it on his shoulder. His entire body went rigid at her touch. She expected him to recoil, to snarl at her for her audacity. Instead, a shuddering sigh escaped his lips. The tension in his shoulders melted away under her palm. The frantic, painful energy emanating from him smoothed out, like a wrinkled cloth being ironed flat. It was the first time they had touched. The connection was electric. She felt the deep, ancient pain of his curse, but she also felt him. The iron will that fought it. The profound loneliness of his battle. And he, for the first time, felt not just the passive calm of her presence, but an active, flowing channel of peace entering him. It was the most profound relief he had ever known. He slowly opened his eyes and looked up at her. The gratitude and wonder in his stormy gaze made her breath catch. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused fingers engulfing hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "How?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "I don't know," she answered honestly. They stayed like that for a long moment, the silence charged with a new, fragile intimacy. The bond between them was solidifying, evolving from a practical necessity into something deeper, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He was still the Beast King, a man of legendary violence and power. But she was beginning to see the prisoner trapped within the beast, and she was, inexplicably, becoming his keeper. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of an unexpected delegation. Gideon entered the study with a grim expression, announcing, "Your Majesty, Alpha Marcus of the Silver Moon Pack is here. He requests an audience." Alistair's face hardened, his hand tightening on a letter opener until his knuckles were white. The calm that had settled in the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, dangerous stillness. "On what grounds?" "He claims concern for the well-being of his pack's Omega," Gideon replied, his gaze flickering almost imperceptibly toward Seraphina. Seraphina felt a jolt of ice in her veins. Marcus. Here. The architect of her public humiliation, the cousin who had tormented her for years. The thought of facing him again made her feel sick. She instinctively took a small step back, closer to the shadows of the bookshelf. Alistair saw the movement. He saw the fear that washed over her face. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, possessive fury. "Send him in," he commanded, his voice dangerously soft. Marcus strode into the study a moment later, his usual arrogance tempered by a thin veneer of fear. He bowed stiffly to the king, but his eyes immediately sought out Seraphina. When he saw her, not scrubbing floors or cowering in a corner, but standing freely in the king's private study, his eyes widened in shock, which quickly curdled into a dark, jealous rage. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his voice tight, I came to inquire about the Omega, to ensure she has not been a burden. She has not, Alistair replied, his voice flat and cold. Marcus's gaze fixed on Seraphina, and he switched to the tone of command he had always used with her. Seraphina, come here. It was a test, a reassertion of his authority over her in front of the king. He was reminding her, and Alistair, that she was his property. Seraphina froze, trapped between the alpha who had owned her and the king who now commanded her. The old fear, the ingrained habit of obedience, warred with the new, fragile sense of safety she had found here. Before she could move, Alistair spoke, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. She will stay where she is. Marcus's head snapped towards the king, his face flushing with anger. With respect, Majesty, she is of my pack. An Omega. She answers to her Alpha. In your lands, she answered to you, Alistair said, rising slowly from his chair. He was a towering, intimidating figure, and he seemed to fill the entire room with his menace. In my fortress, she answers to me. You gave her to me as tribute. The transaction is complete. She is no longer your concern. She is a wolfless, broken thing, Marcus spat, his composure finally cracking. She has no value except what I assign her. What could you possibly want with her? His eyes narrowed with a sudden dawning suspicion as he looked at the way Alistair stood, subtly shielding her from view. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the king's suppressed fury. The curse stirred, awakened by his rage. Seraphina could feel it, a prickling at the back of her neck. She took a deep breath, focusing, pushing a silent wave of calm towards him. Alistair felt it, an anchor in the storm of his anger. His control solidified. He looked at Marcus, his eyes like chips of ice. Her value is for me to determine. Not you. You are dismissed, Alpha Marcus. Do not seek an audience on this matter again. The dismissal was absolute, a final, unarguable command. Humiliated and seething, Marcus shot one last venomous look at Seraphina before turning on his heel and storming out of the study. The moment he was gone, the tension in Alistair's shoulders sagged. He turned to Seraphina, his expression a mixture of fury and concern. Did he hurt you? Not today, she whispered, her voice trembling. The admission of past hurts hung in the air between them. The look on Alistair's face grew darker, more dangerous than she had ever seen it. It was the look of a king who had just discovered a rot in his kingdom, and of a predator whose mate had just been threatened. The confrontation with Marcus left a toxic residue in the air. Alistair paced the study like a caged lion, the violent energy of the curse churning within him, stoked by his protective rage. Seraphina's calming presence was a balm, but it was like trying to soothe a forest fire with a cup of water. His anger was too potent, too righteous. He put his hands on you, Alistair stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It wasn't a question. He had seen the truth in the way she flinched from Marcus's memory. Seraphina didn't answer. She just wrapped her arms around herself, the memory of her cousin's casual cruelty making her shiver. Shoves, harsh grips, the constant reminders of her place. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. The shadowy tendrils began to leak from his skin, faint wisps of darkness that coiled in the air around him. I will kill him, he snarled. I will go to his packlands and tear him apart for touching what is mine. The raw possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver through her, but it wasn't entirely fear. It was a shocking, terrifying thrill. No one had ever claimed her, let alone defended her. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. My lord, no. That is what he wants. He wants to provoke you, to make you seem like the monster they all whisper about. I am a monster, he bit back, turning to face her. The shadows around him were growing thicker. His eyes began to glow with that faint crimson light. You, of all people, should know that. The emotional turmoil of the confrontation was pushing him over the edge. The rage he felt on her behalf was feeding the curse, giving it the power it craved. He was losing control, faster than he ever had before. He clutched his head, a guttural groan tearing from his throat. "Get out, Serafina," he ordered, his voice strained. "Now. Leave me." She saw the panic in his eyes, the desperate fear of what he would become, of what he might do to her. But she didn't move. She had run from scorn and contempt her whole life. She would not run from his pain. "I will not," she said softly, taking a step towards him. "I command you," he roared, his voice distorting, becoming deeper, more bestial. The shadows exploded outwards, enveloping him in a churning vortex of darkness. This was his first true act of defiance for her. Not just defending her from Marcus, but now, trying to protect her from himself. He was pushing her away for her own safety, choosing her well-being over the relief her presence brought him. But she defied him in turn. "I am not afraid of you, Alistair." She used his name for the first time. The sound of it, spoken in her soft, calm voice, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. The vortex of shadows faltered for a second, and in that moment, she saw his face, contorted in a battle for his own soul. He was trying to hold back the transformation, fighting with every ounce of his legendary will. But it was a battle he was doomed to lose. The curse, fed by so much rage, was too strong. The last of his human control shattered. With a sound that was a sickening crack of bone and a roar of pure despair, his body convulsed. Serafina watched, frozen not by fear, but by a profound, heart-wrenching sorrow, as the man she was beginning to know was consumed. He grew larger, his form elongating, twisting. His skin darkened to the color of bruised night, and the shadowy energy solidified, forming plates of jagged, obsidian-like armor over his torso and limbs. His hands became vicious claws, and his face contorted, the features melting and reforming into a lupine muzzle. But it was no wolf she had ever seen. It was a creature from a nightmare, with burning crimson eyes and teeth like shards of glass. This was the devouring wolf, the curse made flesh. The monstrous form threw its head back and unleashed a howl of pure, undiluted agony that vibrated through the very stones of the fortress. It was a sound of eternal torment, of a soul being ripped apart. Gideon burst into the room, sword drawn, his face pale with dread. He saw the beast, saw Serafina standing mere feet from it, and his eyes widened in terror. "My lady, get back!" But Serafina didn't move. She saw the monster, but she also saw the man inside it. She could feel him, a tiny, flickering ember of Alistair buried deep within the raging inferno. He was in there, lost and terrified. Instead of running, she did the most irrational, impossible thing. She took another step forward. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft but clear, refusing to tremble. The creature's burning gaze snapped to her. It lowered its head, a low, threatening growl rumbling in its massive chest. It took a stalking step towards her, the floor groaning under its weight. "Don't," she whispered. She held out a hand, palm open, a gesture of peace. "I am here. I am not leaving." She didn't know where the courage came from. Perhaps it wasn't courage at all, but a certainty that resonated in her very soul. This was why she was here. This was her purpose. The beast paused, its head cocked as if confused. It could feel her. Her unnatural calm, a bizarre and foreign sensation amidst its chaotic rage. It was drawn to it, and repulsed by it in equal measure. Ignoring Gideon's frantic, whispered pleas to run, she closed the remaining distance between them. She stood before the monster, so close she could feel the heat radiating from its shadowy hide. She looked into its glowing crimson eyes and saw the flicker of the trapped king within. Slowly, she raised her hand and placed it on the creature's armored chest. The moment her skin made contact with the cursed form, a wave of pure, golden light emanated from her hand, sinking into the beast's dark hide. The creature roared, but it was not a sound of aggression. It was a sound of shock, of release. Her calming power, no longer passive, flowed from her in a torrent. It was not a cure, but a powerful sedative to the raging curse. The black, jagged armor began to recede. The monstrous form shrank, the bones groaning as they shifted back into a human configuration. Within seconds, the nightmare beast was gone, and Alistair was kneeling on the floor, human once more, gasping for breath, naked and vulnerable. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes wide with a stunned, desperate gratitude. The secret was out, revealed in the most terrifying way possible. He was fully exposed, his greatest weakness, his most profound shame, laid bare before her. The curse of the devouring wolf, he rasped, his voice ragged. It has plagued my bloodline for 1,000 years. It feeds on rage, on pain, and one day it will consume me completely. She knelt in front of him, heedless of his nudity, of the wreckage of the room. She simply looked at him, the man, the king, the prisoner, and her heart filled with a feeling so fierce and protective it stole her breath. "Not while I am here," she vowed, her voice shaking with emotion. The aftermath of the transformation left a fragile, charged silence in its wake. Gideon, after a moment of stunned reverence, quietly retrieved a robe and draped it over his king's shoulders before retreating, closing the doors softly behind him. He understood this was a moment that belonged only to them. Alistair remained on his knees, not moving, his head bowed. He was the most powerful man in the world, a king feared by all, and he had been reduced to this, a vulnerable, broken man at the feet of a wolfless Omega. The shame was a palpable force, rolling off him in waves. "You should have run," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "Everyone else runs." "I am not everyone else," Serafina replied softly. She remained kneeling before him, giving him the respect of meeting him at his lowest point. "And there was nothing to run from. I saw you in there. I saw you fighting." He finally lifted his head, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The sight was so jarring, so contrary to the image of the Beast King, that it made her own eyes burn. "For decades I have fought. I have built walls of ice and iron around myself, starved my own heart of any warmth, any feeling, for fear it would feed the beast. I have lived in a prison of my own making." He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin as if she were made of the most delicate glass. "And then you came. A quiet, impossible peace. My jailer, and my salvation." At his touch, a jolt went through her, a spark of energy that had nothing to do with her calming gift. It was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to sing in her blood, a feeling of rightness, of coming home. It was an echo of something she felt from him, a magnetic pull that was suddenly, overwhelmingly strong. Alistair felt it too. His eyes widened as the sensation, long suppressed and nearly destroyed by the curse, flared to life between them. It was the undeniable, soul-deep recognition of the mate bond. "It cannot be," he whispered, his voice full of wonder and despair. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "The curse. It has smothered my wolf for so long I thought the bond was impossible for me." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the broken Omega, but the other half of his soul. The reason the universe had guided her to him. "Serafina." He breathed her name like a prayer. "You are my mate." The words hung in the air, beautiful and terrible. Her heart soared with a joy so fierce it was painful, even as dread coiled in her stomach. His mate. It felt like the truest thing she had ever heard. But the hope that bloomed in his eyes was immediately extinguished by a wave of bleak reality. He pushed himself to his feet, turning away from her, creating a distance she could feel in her very soul. "And that is why you must leave," he said, his voice flat and dead. "What?" she gasped, the joy turning to ash in her mouth. "No, I don't understand." "Don't you see?" He turned back, his face a mask of anguish. "The curse feeds on my emotions. Rage, pain, but a bond like this? The love for a mate? It is the most powerful emotion of all. It would be like pouring oil on a fire. The beast would become unstoppable. It would use my love for you to destroy me, and then it would come for you. I am too dangerous. To claim you would be to sign your death warrant." His confession was a physical blow. The beautiful, miraculous bond that had just been revealed was not a blessing, but the ultimate threat. He was rejecting her, pushing her away, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, heartbreaking love. News traveled fast within the stone walls of the king's fortress, whispers of the Omega who could soothe the king's infamous temper, who was now a constant presence at his side. The rumors eventually trickled back to the packs, carried by servants and messengers, twisting and warping with each retelling. When the tales reached the ears of Alpha Marcus, his jealous rage festered into a venomous obsession. The wolfless, worthless creature he had thrown away was now rumored to be the king's most trusted companion. It was an intolerable insult to his pride. He became convinced that Seraphina was using some form of witchcraft, some dark art to ensnare the king. But more than that, he sensed an opportunity. He locked himself away with the oldest, most forbidden texts of his pack's lore. He searched for records of the Alpha King's lineage, for any hint of a weakness he could exploit. His rage and suspicion guided him, and finally, he found it. A crumbling, leather-bound tome that spoke of the royal bloodline and its ancient affliction. It described the devouring wolf in horrifying detail, and, most importantly, it spoke of its triggers. The text was clear. The curse was most volatile during the blood moon, a rare celestial event that amplified all primal magic. It also spoke of a specific weakness, a resonance with certain forbidden relics, artifacts infused with chaotic energy that could agitate the curse and force a transformation. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across Marcus's face. The blood moon was less than a month away, and the ceremony was to be held at the king's own fortress. All the alphas would be in attendance. It was the perfect stage. He began to conspire. He reached out to other ambitious alphas, those who chafed under Alistair's iron rule and saw him as a tyrant. He planted seeds of doubt, whispering about the king's instability, his unnatural seclusion. He spoke of a king weakened, perhaps even mad. "He keeps a wolfless Omega as a pet," he would sneer to the alpha of the Blackstone pack, a notoriously ruthless wolf named Fenrir. "He shuns his council, his warriors. Something is wrong with him. His reign is faltering." Marcus didn't reveal the full truth of the curse. He kept that knowledge for himself, his trump card. He simply promised them a chance to see the king's weakness for themselves, to witness an event that would give them the justification they needed to challenge his throne. He located the relic mentioned in the text, the Heart of Chaos, a shard of obsidian that pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy, hidden away in his pack's vault for centuries. It was a dangerous, forbidden artifact, but Marcus was beyond caring about the old laws. His mind was consumed with a single burning goal: to expose Alistair, to destroy him, and in doing so, to destroy the woman who had defied him. He would show the world that Seraphina hadn't tamed a king. She had merely chained herself to a monster, and he would be the one to unleash it. The night of the blood moon arrived, painting the sky in ominous shades of crimson. The great hall of the king's fortress was filled with the powerful alphas of the territories, their finest ceremonial furs on display, their faces tense with anticipation. The ceremony was a tradition meant to renew oaths of fealty, but tonight, the air was thick with a different kind of energy, conspiracy and impending violence. Alistair stood on the dais, Seraphina a step behind him and to his right. He had insisted she be there, a public acknowledgement of her place at his side. Her presence was a comfort, a steadying anchor against the malevolent pull of the moon, which was already making the curse stir restlessly beneath his skin. He wore a mask of regal calm, but she could feel the tension coiling in his muscles, the effort it took to maintain control. Marcus stood among the other alphas, his eyes glittering with a feverish light. Hidden within the folds of his cloak, his hand rested on the heart of chaos. The relic was cold to the touch, and it seemed to thrum with a life of its own, hungry for the chaos it was about to unleash. The ceremony began. One by one, the alphas approached the dais to renew their vows. As Marcus's turn came, he walked forward, his expression a mask of false deference. He knelt before Alistair, bowing his head. I, Alpha Marcus of the Silver Moon Pack, renew my vow of loyalty to my Alpha King, he recited, his voice ringing with false sincerity. But as he spoke, he subtly opened his cloak, exposing the heart of chaos. He angled it directly at Alistair. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A wave of pure, chaotic energy slammed into Alistair. It was a psychic assault, bypassing all his mental and physical defenses and striking directly at the curse. He cried out, a raw, strangled sound, staggering back as if struck by a physical blow. Seraphina rushed to his side, her hand going to his arm. Alistair! But it was too late. The relic's power, amplified by the blood moon, was a catalyst. The devouring wolf, which he had been holding in a fragile balance, roared to life. The shadowy tendrils exploded from him, no longer whispers of smoke, but thick, powerful limbs of living darkness. His body began to contort, the sickening crack of his bones echoing in the stunned silence of the hall. Chaos erupted. The alphas scrambled back, their expressions turning from shock to terror, and, for some, to greedy opportunity. "Behold your king!" Marcus bellowed, rising to his feet and pointing a triumphant finger. "A monster! A cursed beast who is unfit to rule. He has hidden this abomination from us all." The transformation was complete. The nightmare creature stood on the dais, larger and more terrifying than it had been in the study. Fueled by the blood moon's energy, it was a being of pure, unreasoning rage. It let out a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the hall and fixed its burning crimson eyes on the assembled alphas. This was the moment Marcus had planned for, the signal for the trap to spring. He and the handful of alphas he had conspired with drew their blades, their moment of rebellion finally at hand. The beast that was once Alistair lunged. It moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed, a blur of shadow and claw. It was not the calculated attack of a warrior, but the indiscriminate rage of a cornered animal. It swiped at the nearest alphas, sending them flying across the room like broken dolls. Panic turned the hall into a maelstrom of shouting and screaming. Now, Fenrir, the Blackstone Alpha, roared to his allies, "Strike it down while it is lost to madness." The traitorous alphas, emboldened by the creature's seeming lack of control, moved to surround it. They were powerful warriors, and together, they believed they could overwhelm the monster. Swords and axes glinted in the crimson moonlight that streamed through the high windows, but Marcus had a different target. While the others engaged the raging beast, he turned his malevolent gaze on Seraphina. She was the key. He had seen the way the king looked at her. He knew, with a dark and certain instinct, that she was the monster's anchor. If he could eliminate her, whatever hold Alistair had would shatter completely, leaving the beast to be slaughtered. He drew a long, wicked-looking dagger from his belt and started towards her, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant hatred. "This is for defying me, you wolfless wretch," he snarled. "You should have stayed in the dirt where you belonged." Seraphina backed away, her heart seized by a cold, sharp fear. Gideon moved to intercept him, but he was knocked aside by another of the rebel alphas. There was no one between her and Marcus. The beast was in the throes of its violent rage, lashing out at its attackers. But through the crimson haze of the curse, a part of Alistair saw it. He saw Marcus advancing on Seraphina, the dagger gleaming in his hand. He saw the terror on her face. And in that instant, a choice was made. Love, the very emotion he feared would be his undoing, became his salvation. The raw, primal need to protect his mate cut through the curse's chaotic fog. It was a single, shining point of clarity in an ocean of madness. Protect her. The beast stopped its indiscriminate rampage. It ignored the swords hacking at its shadowy hide. With a roar that was no longer just rage, but a clear, focused threat, it spun around. It moved with impossible speed, not to attack Marcus, but to place its own massive, monstrous body between him and Seraphina. It shielded her completely. It was the ultimate sacrifice. In protecting her, it left its back completely exposed to the other alphas. Fenrir saw his chance. With a triumphant cry, he lunged forward, plunging his silver-edged greatsword deep into the creature's back. The beast roared in agony, a terrible, soul-rending sound. It shuddered, its crimson eyes flickering. It had chosen to save her, even if it meant its own destruction. Seraphina watched the silver blade sink into Alistair's monstrous form, and something inside her broke. Not with fear, but with a fierce, burning clarity. The passive, gentle calm she had always possessed was not enough. It was a shield. But what he needed now was a weapon of peace. She looked at his sacrifice, at the body of the beast that trembled with agony but did not move from its position shielding her. She saw his choice, an act of love so profound it transcended the curse, transcended everything. And she made her own choice. She stepped out from behind his protective form, her eyes blazing with a light no one had ever seen in them before. She was no longer the timid, broken Omega. She was a queen defending her king. "Enough," she said. Her voice did not shout, but it resonated through the hall, cutting through the sounds of battle and panic. It carried an impossible weight, a power of absolute command that made every wolf, loyalist and traitor alike, freeze in their tracks. She closed her eyes for a second, reaching deep inside herself, to the quiet center she had always nurtured. But instead of just holding it, she pushed it. She actively channeled her soothing energy, not just at Alistair, but outwards, projecting it like a wave. A wave of profound supernatural peace washed through the hall. It was not a suggestion, it was a force. The rage in the hearts of the attacking alphas dissolved, replaced by a stunned confusion. The bloodlust faded, the adrenaline vanished. Swords felt heavy and useless in their hands. The very air seemed to sigh with relief. She walked forward, her steps sure and steady, until she stood before Alistair's wounded, trembling form. Fenrir and the others stumbled back, their eyes wide with awe and a new kind of fear. This was a power they had never encountered, a magic beyond their comprehension. Seraphina placed her hands on the creature's shadowy hide, right over the terrible wound. The silver of the blade sizzled against its cursed flesh, a fatal poison. She looked up into its pained crimson eyes, seeing the flicker of the man she loved within. "You are not a monster," she said, her voice ringing with the truth of her soul. She poured all of her love, all of her acceptance, into her words and her touch. "You are my king. You are my mate." Her declaration, a pure and absolute acceptance of him, all of him, man and beast, was the final key. Her power, amplified by the mate bond, surged into him. It was not a bomb this time, but a catalyst for a different kind of transformation. The golden light that emanated from her didn't just soothe the curse, it integrated it. The shadow beast did not retreat. Instead, it flowed, merging with the spirit of his wolf, with the soul of the man. The jagged, armored hide softened, becoming sleek, dark fur. The monstrous form reshaped itself, becoming a massive, powerful black wolf, larger than any dire wolf of legend, with eyes that were no longer crimson, but his own stormy gray, filled with a new, complete intelligence. The silver sword was expelled from his back, as the wound healed in a wash of golden light. He was no longer a man with a curse. He was a king with a power unlike any other, the shadow and the light, the man and the beast, finally made whole. He was healed. The curse was broken. Alistair, in his new, magnificent wolf form, turned his head and gently nudged Seraphina's hand, a gesture of profound gratitude. Then he turned his intelligent, stormy gaze upon the traitorous alphas. The power rolling off him was immense, 10 times what it had been before, but it was controlled, focused, and utterly terrifying. Fenrir dropped his sword with a clang, falling to his knees. "Mercy, my king." The other traitors followed suit, prostrating themselves on the floor, their brief rebellion crushed not by mindless violence, but by a power they could not fight. Alistair's gaze finally settled on Marcus, who stood frozen, his dagger still in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The great wolf took a silent, stalking step towards him. It didn't growl. It didn't need to. The predatory intent was a palpable force. Marcus's arrogance finally shattered, replaced by raw terror. He turned to flee, but Alistair was on him in a single, fluid bound. He did not kill him. He simply pinned him to the floor with a paw the size of a dinner plate and let out a single deafening roar in his face, a roar that promised retribution. Then he stepped back, allowing the loyal guards to haul the trembling, broken alpha away. His fate would be decided later, but his power was gone forever. With the traitors secured, Alistair shifted back. The transition was smooth, effortless. He stood before his people, no longer a man hiding a monster, but a king reborn, his power absolute and his control perfect. He walked to Seraphina, ignoring everyone else, and drew her into his arms. In front of all the assembled leaders of the wolf-shifter world, he lowered his head and marked her. His teeth gently grazed the juncture of her neck and shoulder, a flood of warmth and possessive energy sealing their bond for all eternity. A gasp went through the crowd. The wolfless Omega, the broken tribute, was now their queen. He lifted his head and spoke, his voice ringing with an authority that none would ever dare to question again. "This is Seraphina, my mate, my queen. Her voice is my voice. An insult to her is an act of treason against the crown. Her power did not just save me, it has saved us all. She is the heart of this kingdom." The alphas, who had once scorned her or ignored her, now looked upon her with a deep, abiding awe. They had witnessed a miracle. They had seen the quietest soul wield a power greater than any sword. They knelt, not just to their king, but to their new queen, their loyalty absolute and freely given. The reign of King Alistair and Queen Seraphina marked the beginning of a new era. The stories of that night on the blood moon spread like wildfire, becoming legend. The tale of the wolfless Omega who tamed the Beast King and saved the kingdom changed the very fabric of their society. Seraphina's influence was a quiet but powerful tide. She had known what it was to be an outcast, to be devalued for not fitting the brutal mold of their world. With Alistair's full support, She began to enact changes that rippled through every pack. She established sanctuaries, places of learning and community for Omegas and others who were deemed weak by the old standards. She taught them that strength was not just found in tooth and claw, but in empathy, in resilience, in intelligence, and in courage. The term Omega began to lose its sting, shifting from a mark of shame to a title for those who served as the heart and soul of the pack, the healers, the teachers, the mediators. Alistair, freed from the torment of his curse, ruled with a wisdom and strength he had never been able to fully embrace. The cold, ruthless tyrant was gone, replaced by a just and formidable king. His love for Seraphina was evident in every glance, every touch. He listened to her counsel above all others, and together they governed with a perfect balance of power and compassion. The kingdom thrived. Old rivalries between packs began to dissolve, replaced by a new sense of unity. The focus shifted from constant preparation for war to the cultivation of a lasting peace. They learned that the strength of the kingdom was not measured by the power of its strongest alpha, but by how it cared for its most vulnerable members. Seraphina never lost her quiet nature. She was not a queen of grand pronouncements, but of small, meaningful actions. She would walk through the castle halls and the city streets, speaking to servants and commoners, her calming presence a constant, reassuring gift to her people. They adored her. She was not just their queen, she was their hope, a living testament to the idea that the greatest strength could be found in the gentlest of hearts. Alistair would often watch her, a look of unending wonder on his face. She had walked into the darkest part of his soul and turned on a light. She had taken his greatest weakness and helped him forge it into his greatest strength. He was no longer a king ruling from a place of fear and pain, but one ruling from a place of love and wholeness. Their union had not just saved them, it had healed their entire world. 1 year later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of their chambers, looking out over the sprawling, peaceful city below. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of baking bread and blooming night jasmine from the royal gardens. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved weight settled against her back. Alistair rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand coming to rest protectively over her gently swollen belly. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "I was thinking about the Grand Conclave," she said softly, "about a terrified girl hiding in an alcove, wishing she could disappear." He tightened his embrace, his thumb stroking her abdomen. "And I was thinking about a king who walked into that hall searching for a cure, and instead found his soul." He turned her in his arms, his stormy eyes filled with a love so deep it still took her breath away. "Thank you, Seraphina, for not running." "There was nowhere to run," she replied, smiling as she placed a hand on his cheek. "My heart recognized you long before my mind did. It knew it was already home." A small, insistent kick came from within her womb, a reminder of the new life they had created. Alistair's face lit up with a joy that was still new and wondrous to him. He knelt, pressing a gentle kiss to her belly. "He has your strength, little one," Alistair whispered to their unborn son, "and hopefully, a little of my charm." Seraphina laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the evening air. It was a sound of pure happiness, something the girl in the alcove would never have thought possible. The silence where her wolf should have been was no longer empty. It was filled with the love of her mate, the life of her child, and the peace of a kingdom she had helped to heal. They stood together as darkness fell and the stars began to appear, a king and queen who had found each other in the dark. The feared Beast King was a legend of the past, replaced by a loving husband and father. The Rejected Omega was a story whispered to pups, a tale of how the quietest heart can hold the greatest power. Their kingdom was prosperous, their people were happy, and their love was the foundation upon which a new, better world had been built.